Welcome back to The Presence Paradigm. I am your host, Brevinn Tyler. Thank you so much for taking a moment to make a moment with me where we're going to learn exactly how it is that the Holy Spirit impacts us in our present life. This is episode 2, or I guess part 2 of an episode that we did with James Clark starting 2 weeks ago. If you missed that one, definitely go take a look at it. We got into some really fantastic topics. We even ended off talking about what it looks like to honor God with your body, how you can go about that, whether that's being married or being single for 60 years. There's so much insights that he's been able to provide, and that's only going to continue. I'm so glad that we get to do part 2 and that it's going to really just start right in the middle and get to take off from here. We're going to start by talking about some of his experience in Russia as a minister for 20 years, what different things he came up against there, how it's a little bit different here in the United States. And there's so much wisdom and experience to be learned. I had so much fun getting to record it. Getting to share it with you is even more so. So without further ado, let's get into it. This once again is James Clark. I think one of the coolest things that I could have known about you before getting to know you was the fact that you spent 30 years in ministry and 20 of them were in Russia. How do you come to the decision that you feel comfortable to move to another country where you had no awareness of the language or the culture or the people? What does that look like? How do you get that level of obedience that God says is where I want you to go?
And just to add to the mix, at the time, I had a great job, great house, great job. Honestly, they were overpaying me. I loved my work. I would have done it for less. And I chunked all of it and headed off literally to the other end of the globe. Where I started in Russia is 11 time zones from here.
Goodness gracious.
So, having been raised through church, I was perfectly aware of missions, had no problems with the concept. Mission trips, wonderful things, so long you're the one going on them. Me going on them. No. You come back, you tell me what a great blessing, we'll all be happy.
Yeah.
And then around my 30th birthday, a person who at the time was my best friend had committed to long-term missions, and he invited me to a 2-week summer camp to tell kids about Christ in a camp that used to be a propaganda camp for Marxist theory, to make kids more communist.
Goodness. Tell me, what year is this?
This would have been 1993, so the Soviet Union had been dead for about 2.5 years.
Country reeling.
3 generations of atheism.
Wow.
Where the government actively promoted there is no God. And us having the opportunity to say, not only is there a God, he wants you, he loves you, he died for you. The chief reason I went, I'm going to be honest, I thought this guy was a chump, and if he can do it, surely I can do it. I mean, really.
Crazy what rationalizations we'll use to push ourselves in the direction God's calling us.
So I went, and it was a phenomenal 2 weeks. I saw not just kids, but adults soak it in like sponges. So happy to see us, so happy to hear it. Came back, we had a debriefing meeting and maybe 2 or 3 weeks after the trip. And I could tell for everybody else, it was a cool memory. It wasn't just a memory for me. I couldn't shake it. And I argued with God for a while because, I'm an accountant. In my mind, missionaries were either pastors or doctors or nurses or that.
Yeah.
I wasn't any of that. God, I'm an accountant. What am I going to account for in Russia? He had me to read the book of Amos, one of the minor prophets in the Old Testament. And Amos was literally a migrant farmhand. He tended other people's farms. He didn't even own one. And God called him out of the fields to prophesy. And he goes to Samaria and reads of the riot act. God is unhappy, and he's going to come down on you like nobody's business if you don't change. And the head priest comes out and basically says, go home, we're not interested. And I think around the middle of the book of Amos, Amos says, I am not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet. In other words, he was saying, this is not my day job. This is not what I do for a living. God called me to do this. I'm going to do it. Like it, lump it, your deal. I'm doing it. Right? And it spoke to me of God was fully aware of the fact that I was an accountant. No, him being God and all. B, he didn't care. What he cared about was my heart. And the fact that as a boy, many times I've told him, God, I'm your guy. Tell me what you need. I'll do it. Can I be honest with you? It was a bluff. I never really thought he'd ever take me up on it.
Of course.
No. Just as a word to the wise, don't try to outbluff God. It ain't going to work. He called me to it, and I figured a year, 2, and wound up 10 in Russia, 11 more in Ukraine.
Goodness. Tell the story of you coming home from Russia, because there was a time in between.
There was.
Break that down for us, please.
Yeah. So, my last year in Russia, visas were an ongoing problem. It had gotten from a year visa to 6-month visa to 3-month visas, which meant you had to leave the country every time in order to get a visa. And the last time I left, 2 suitcases in hand, because I'll be back in a couple of weeks anyway.
Emphasis, last time you left.
That was the spring of 2004. I haven't been back since.
Goodness.
As a side note, you and other people that I call my friends, the whole lot of you would say in unison, James says, I love you a lot.
Yeah.
There's a reason why.
Yeah.
It's because when I left, I had friends there that I didn't spend a lot of time saying goodbye to or telling them how much I loved them. I never got the chance to do it. And I vowed before my God, it will happen again. People who know me are going to know that I love them, because I'm going to tell them all the whole time. So, got back to the States, and I pulled every string I could to go back, and it was not going to happen. And every attempt I made, nothing. I couldn't even get a guest visa to go back in and clean out my apartment.
Goodness.
So in one fell swoop, I lost my ministry, I lost my friends, I lost all my stuff, except for the 2 suitcases that I had. And had to wind up back in my mother's house as a grown man.
No. Talk about having to have that manly identity reinforced again.
Oh my gosh. You know, any guy can lose a job, but it takes a real man to lose his job, all his stuff, and have to move back into his mama's house all on the same day.
Yeah.
That's what I accomplished. I'm going to be honest with you. I was hacked at God. And I was so incensed. God, what's your deal? You tell me to go, I went. 5 of those 10 years, I was in Siberia, and everything you've heard about Siberia, it's true.
Boy.
5 years in Siberia, 5 more on the other side. I did exactly what you asked me to do. This is what I get for it.
Where's the blessing for my obedience?
Yes. God, you're not keeping your end of the deal. What's your deal? Oh my gosh.
Side note, this is the connection that you got to make where you said, if you're at odds with God, one of you wrong and it's not him.
Apparently, I had not figured it out at that stage as part of my sanctification process.
Got to go through. That's the scale you had.
That was the scale.
That one picked.
That was the scale. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So about 4 months of being hacked at God and telling him just how cruel and unfair and how he wasn't keeping his end of the deal and what's up with you. Apparently 4 months is about God's outer limit of whiny and cranky.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine who lives in downtown Tampa invited me to his church. There was a Messianic Jew, a Jew who has accepted Christ as a Savior, and he had been invited to the church to explain a Seder, a Passover supper, which often happens around Easter time.
Okay.
And I didn't have anything else going on, and well, this is kind of interesting, and Judeo-Christian roots that I have, and all of that. So yeah, I'll go. And a full Seder runs multiple hours. It is a long, drawn-out, ritualistic process. So the gentleman was hitting just the high points, just point after point, just kind of going through things quickly. Mm-hmm. But he stopped at one particular prayer that is recited to this day at Passover suppers. And it is prayer that was probably written by the Pharisee who taught Paul, to be a Pharisee.
Okay.
There is a decent chance that Christ, as the rabbi, might have said this prayer at the Last Supper, which was, after all, a Passover supper.
Of course.
So the possibility exists that this was actually recited at the Last Supper.
Wow.
And it is an accounting of what God did to bring the Hebrews out of Egypt. Because after all, the Passover is when the angel of death passed over the Hebrews with the blood on the doorsill.
Of course.
So all the things that God did to bring the Hebrews out of Egypt, except it's a step-by-step process. Mm-hmm. And the basic of the prayer is that the rabbi would read the first step and would stop, and everyone around the Passover table says, it would have been enough, or just enough. Mm. With the premise of, had God done that one thing and that one thing alone and nothing else ever, the people of Israel would have no choice but to look God square in the face and say, that was enough for us. Because frankly, it was more than they deserved. Right? Mm-hmm. I would love to recite it because it's worth the recitation.
Please.
If he had taken us out of Egypt, but not made judgments on them,
enough.
If he had made judgments on them, but had not made their gods,
enough.
As in to destroy. Mm-hmm. If he had destroyed their gods, but not killed their firstborn.
Enough.
If he had killed their firstborn, but had not given us their money.
Enough.
If he had given us their money, but had not split the sea in two for us.
Enough.
If he had split the sea in two for us, but had not taken us through on dry land.
Enough.
If he had taken us through on dry land, but had not pushed our enemies down into the sea.
Enough.
If he had pushed our enemies down into the sea, but not supplied our needs in the wilderness for 40 years.
Enough.
If he had supplied our needs in the wilderness for 40 years, but not given us manna.
Enough.
If he had given us manna, but had not given us the Sabbath.
Enough.
If he had given us the Sabbath, but had not brought us close to Mount Sinai.
Enough.
If he had brought us close to Mount Sinai, but had not given us the Torah, the law.
Enough.
Had he given us the Torah, but had not brought us into the land of Israel.
Enough.
If he had not brought us into the land of Israel, if he had brought us into the land of Israel, but had not given us the temple.
Enough.
So we're going through this prayer with me, along with everybody else. Mm-hmm. Enough. Over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And having already gained an understanding of what God's voice sounds like, clearly, God in this prayer was saying, really? Because what had I've been doing for 4 months, I had been telling God point blank, not enough.
Yep.
You owe me.
Yep.
You haven't kept your end of the deal. And God in this prayer was making it clear to me there was never a deal to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Was he obligated to do anything ever for me?
Of course not.
No. Again, back to grace. Grace is a gift. It's not an obligation on God's part. It's a gift from God.
Yep.
Undeserved.
Yep.
Utterly.
Completely.
Complete. So everything that's done for us is by God's good grace.
Mm-hmm.
Not because he's obligated to do or say or give anything ever.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, had he saved me as a 13-year-old boy and just left me there, I would have no choice but to tell God, enough.
Yep.
Just the fact you saved me.
Yep.
Enough. But he's done so many things since then. So in this prayer, God makes it clear. Can you really honestly tell me? You're saying enough, but you don't mean it.
How are you going to show me?
Again, not being a stupid child, I said, Uncle,
Yeah.
I give up.
Yeah.
And told him with a pure heart before him, if it is your will for me never to have ministry ever again, to never speak to another child ever, to never mentor another soul, to live under a bridge in a cardboard box and eat food from the dumpster and starve and die of a horrible illness, then the only thing I get to say to you is,
Enough.
for all the things you've done to me through this point.
Yeah.
And can I tell you, Brevinn, this prayer has cropped up in my head over and over again through the years. Anytime, like that little boy, I put my spiritual hands on my spiritual hips and tell God what I will and won't do,
Yeah.
he asked me, enough?
Mm-hmm.
It is concerning the number of Christians who think God's obligated to do things for them. Because the facts are the facts. He's not. Anything he gives you, anything he blesses you with, anything he teaches you, any way he sanctifies you, that's all grace.
Yeah. The expanse of that grace to literally every single part of your life. It's unbelievable. We can't imagine the fact that we say it all the time. Oh, I woke up today. That's a gift from God. But do you know how many days you've woken up that you just don't deserve waking up? If we bring this back to kind of what I was mentioning around the idea of death, the fear of death, the idea that to this point we have had such potential that we want to see that potential realized before we pass. Even if you don't, enough. The fact that you had potential, enough. If I pass tomorrow, enough. And that's how you can not rationalize, because he doesn't need rationalizing from our petty perspective. But that's how you can look at God and say, sometimes bad things happen. The fact that one good thing happened, enough. Our passing or the tragedy that can happen with death, nobody wants that, including God, but that doesn't change his status as being good, because there was a good at any point to be sad about. He is good, and that goodness is enough.
And the fact remains that if a young person dies, one thinks of the lost potential, but who's to say that that's true?
Truth.
The young man in the cemetery salesman, he's been dead longer than you've been alive. But his memory and his model of Christ still sits in my head.
Yeah, and now it's going to sit in my head.
He has an influence, has an influence, even now, on me. So what we, as mortals, would say was lost potential, He fulfilled the calling that God had for his life in that short time. He fulfilled it. Maybe he's a little brighter than us. His sanctification was about that long.
Yeah. That's such a good point. There's a cool, like, political cartoon almost of a man who's tied to a post, and he has this radical idea. It doesn't actually show you what the idea is, but you just know, okay, that's a radical idea he has. And he's tied to the post as a prisoner, and he's on the firing line. And you watch him get shot at. It's not this graphic, but you watch him get shot and killed. And there's a little kid there that has a balloon, and he watches the set. When the gentleman dies, the idea, the thought bubble that he had remains. Everyone leaves. The kid goes and releases the balloon, grabs the thought bubble, and walks away with it. That's the picture that comes to my head when you talk about the influence that we can have beyond the grave. Here is that when we can represent Christ, your Father's influence, so deeply represented, so genuinely and authentically represented, that you carry that with you still today.
And you may not think of it, but at 55, trust me, from this end of life, that's young. Far too young. But you speak truth. The influence that he's had, just not on me, but on the probably 2 or 3 dozen people who say, James's daddy used to say.
Yeah. And now I'm at home telling my wife, James's dad said that a cat is more preparing you for a teenager than and dogs prepare you for toddlers.
It's true.
We're going to be ready on all fronts in this case. But that level of, like, there is a physical death, but the ideological death doesn't. Ideology goes beyond the death. Faithfulness goes beyond death. His grace will go beyond your death. And it extends into something different. It's a different existence. Just in the same way that we've had to realize that an existence on the internet is different than a physical existence. I guess that's a good analogy, kind of comparison that runs alongside of that.
What the internet counts as a friend and what I count as a friend aren't even vaguely the same thing. It's the same word, completely different meaning.
Of course. Chastity.
Completely different.
Yeah.
Obedience. Totally different.
While we're on it, submission.
Yes. And if we're going to jump there, let's be really, really frank. Far too many of us guys think submission, that's what our wives are supposed to do.
Yeah.
We're all called to submission. A radio program that I heard many years ago, a couple married as unbelievers, he came to Christ. As is often the case, he tried to cram a Bible down his wife's throat. She was having none of it, to the point that she divorced him.
Wow.
Shortly after the divorce, she came to Christ, and God made it clear, you need to go back to your husband. And they did, married a second time, and they're having a great marriage. In the radio podcast, she says the chief turnoff of the first time we were married, he would tell me I had to submit to him, but clearly he was not in submission to God.
Yep.
Brother, hair on the back of my neck standing up.
Yep.
God making it clear, submission is what we all are called to do as Christ followers.
Yeah.
As Americans, we hate bending our knee to anything or to anybody. And that's the exact thing that God calls us to do, to bend our knee to him.
It's like we have this perspective of freedom, and submission is anti-freedom.
Yes. It's quite the opposite. Let me give you the best analogy I've ever heard of submission.
Please.
An umbrella. You're outside, you have an umbrella, it's raining cats and dogs. I mean, it is coming down.
That'll probably be 4 o'clock today.
Yes.
As it is 4:30 every single day here.
Every day. Welcome to Florida. Can you stand on top of your umbrella?
Of course not.
What stops you? You have the ability.
True.
Of course. You can stand on top of your umbrella.
Okay.
Go for it. Are you going to get wet?
Guaranteed.
Okay. Well, then, can you open your umbrella and stand in the upside down umbrella?
Yes.
You can.
Sure.
Are you going to get wet? Yes. That's the one and only way that you stay dry, is you submit to the umbrella, which means what? You allow the umbrella to do what it was called to do
Yeah.
in the way that it was called. Mm-hmm. It was called to keep you dry by putting it over you.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that you're somehow less of a human? Or it's more umbrella?
Of course not.
No. No, the umbrella is doing what the umbrella is supposed to do.
Mm.
That's submission. Is allowing, as a married man, allowing God to be God in your life, submitting to him because he's God, you're not.
Right.
And you're the example of submission to your wife. Mm-hmm. If it's clear and evident that you're submitted to your God, then her submitting to you is the same thing. She's allowing you to be you.
Mm-hmm. And I think Paul says that in 2 Corinthians. He says that. He just says it in the opposite order. He says, wives, submit to your husbands, and then da-da-da-da-da-da, husbands, submit to God. You ask me every day, how do you love your wife? Just as Christ loved the church, to the point that he died for her. Died for her, submitted to her. And so if only Paul would have gotten it right and put it in the other order, but got it right, of course.
And let's carry the example just a little further.
Please.
Because what did Christ often call the church? His bride.
Mm-hmm.
So what was he, the husband, doing for his bride? He was submitting to God. Mm-hmm. Though he was God himself, he was submitting to his Father. He was letting his Father be his Father. Mm-hmm. He was letting God do what God does. Mm-hmm. And he was willing to submit himself in order for the church to be willing to submit to him.
To have the example.
The model.
Yep.
And it makes sense for our sisters. Why would I want to submit to a husband who refuses to submit to anything or to anybody?
Yep. You have to be able to have that within yourself. I think when I think of the first example, and I just got to tell this gentleman this, and it gave me great joy to tell him how much of an inspiration that he was at that point in time. When I was in Colorado, I met with a pastor. He actually came to our football chapel before the game. I came to kind of know him, started going to his church. The very first service that I went to at this church, there was a bunch of Australians in there with accents. And there was a bounce house outside. I was like, what is going on in here? They were celebrating the fact that this church in Grand Junction, Colorado, was going to come under the authority of a church in Melbourne, Australia. The churches happened to share a name.
Sure.
It was just how the pastor of the church in Grand Junction found the church in Australia.
Wow.
He connected with their head pastor there. They would be considered a mega church in Australia. Lots of influence. And he reached out to him on his own accord and said, I'm a man who needs to be under a man of authority. And I consistently think back to that example and admire the amount of courage that it takes to say that. This is a man with family. He's 4 kids. He was in the military, which probably is why he had some of the forethought to even understand how hierarchy and authority can work and benefit you. But he submitted himself to someone across the world, similar to you, submitted himself to someone across the world because he was honoring God with his obedience. And that's what he was called to do. And it wasn't like maybe we can be equal or you'll have a little influence over here. It was, I'm going to meet with you every week and you are going to make decisions about my church that I don't like. but I'm submitting myself to you. It was such an impressive example. And sometimes I think it takes you seeing an example before you can really understand it yourself, which is why your community has been so beneficial when it comes to reinforcing your identity as a man. The gentleman that went across, even if you think that you can be better than the example that was set, that gentleman who spent 2 weeks in Russia and you said, I can do it if he can do it.
Yes. And let me tell you what a sense of humor God has. He committed to long-term missions. He was there for 2 months. Mm-hmm. I committed to 2 weeks. I was there for 21 years, which may be one more reason not to tell God what you will and won't do.
Yeah. Truth. He might send you across the world and keep you there for a while.
Even as a bachelor, I'm not silly enough to think that this whole submission thing is just instantaneous. It is imperfectly done because we're imperfect humans.
Of course. But
God, through Christ, has set a superb example of what that ought to look like. But it's what it's worth striving for. Mm-hmm. The world's understanding of submission is someone has to be less than somebody else. It's simply not the case. Mm-hmm.
That's such a great point. That someone has to go underneath and be subjugated. Subjugated and submission are not the same thing.
No.
Oppressed and submitted. What a favorite word of our culture, oppression.
They're not interchangeable words.
No. Because that's what I think people are feeling. They feel like they're being oppressed. But that's what someone does to you. You decide to be submitted.
When I was a little boy, let's say I'm in the kitchen and my mother's cooking on the stove. And as a toddler, 3, I'm naturally attracted to whatever's going on over at whatever that big thing is over there. Mm-hmm. And I reach my hand up to the hot stove. Is my mother oppressing me? She slaps my hand. Is she this tyrant who doesn't want me to have any fun? No. No, she is loving me out of love, out of affection. Mm-hmm. It's not that she doesn't want me to have fun. She doesn't want me to burn my hand.
Of course.
And submission is very similar. It's, again, we're not dealing with an old fuddy-duddy God that doesn't want you to have fun. Mm-hmm. He wants to give you the boundaries because you need the boundaries. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make you any less of a person for keeping within the boundaries. Mm-hmm. And even in marriage, he set up boundaries. And as long as you keep to the boundaries, things work a lot better than they would have otherwise. And again, I'm not silly enough to say it works perfectly, but it does work better.
Yeah. How cool that you get to have so much insight into marriage, having not ever been in one yourself. You say this all the time. You'll be like, yeah, these married men keep coming to me for advice.
Because at least a part of marriage is simply the relationship between any two humans.
Yep.
Granted, the dynamic's completely different. But relationships are relationships.
Yep.
And let's just cut honest. We serve a God who literally exists in relationship. Mm-hmm. Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
In relationship with himself.
With himself.
Yeah.
And let's logically look at it. If I can improve my relationship with the one who isn't the author of relationship, he is relationship. Mm-hmm. If I can improve my relationship with him, does it not stand to reason that all my other relationships are going to either improve or be burned away like the chaff that they need to be burned away?
Yeah.
Either way, it's for my better.
Yep.
And that's in marriage, in work relationships, with colleagues, with friends, with mentors, with people that you need to mentor. Mm-hmm. All of those relationships is based primarily on, do I have a good relationship with he who is relationship?
Right.
And a lot of the advice to my married men is just that. You whine about your your relationship with your wife, let's talk about your relationship with your God. Does God whine about you?
Right. That's such a good point. And such like a, how about we take some responsibility here? That's submission,
Yes.
taking responsibility.
Yes.
And what you think she might be the source of all your problems. Let's take some responsibility here. How is your relationship with your creator? Because that is going to overflow into all of your other relationships. And when I think of marriage, I might just be speaking off the top of my head here. A marriage, 90% of the time, is the same as a roommate relationship.
Yes.
10% of the time, it's special. Like, you do your own thing. But at least before kids, 90% of the time, it's like living with a roommate.
Yes.
And we all have that experience.
Of course.
So yeah, why wouldn't those ideas transfer over on all different kinds of spectrums?
Including the physical intimacy aspect. A good brother of mine that came to me whining about that part of his marriage was rocky and unsatisfying and we talked about it, we prayed over it. And one of the things with me, if you say, James, I need you to pray about A, B, and C, plan on me a week, a month, a year from now coming back to you and saying, so, tell me about A, B, and C.
Yeah.
Because I want to know. If I'm going to take the time to pray on it, I want to know what God did. So a few weeks later, I asked him, what's going on? And he said, oh, James, oh my gosh, night and day difference. That has completely changed, far to the better. I said, really? What happened? He said, I started pursuing her the same way God pursues me. To which I said, without shock, what do you know?
Things change when you do that. Yeah. And I'm going to say it because I'm thinking it, but these are your words. In situations like that, I mentioned to you earlier how a fire can even be misplaced inside of a marriage. A lot of people, as you've taught me, who are in that situation aren't seeking intimacy. They're seeking intensity.
Yes.
And when we're set on the wrong goal, we'll go the wrong way of getting about it, or we'll get there the wrong way. But when we can reorient our relationship with God around intimacy with him, that intimacy will carry into this other relationship too.
We, as mortals, crave intimacy. No matter who you are, no matter how big and tough and whatever you think you are, really, truly, in your heart of hearts, you crave intimacy. And that's because we serve a God who craves intimacy. Could he have lived quite well without ever creating us? Yes.
Sure.
He didn't have to create any of us or do anything for us.
Gifts.
But he craves intimacy to the point where he made us in order to have intimacy with us. Far too often, and again, it's because we don't hear God's voice. We think other voices, maybe that's God. I'll pay attention to him or her. And one of those voices says that the intensity of the physical act of sex is the same thing as intimacy.
Right.
It's not. They're different. And intensity is nice. I'm not going to argue the point. I've got no bones to pick on that one.
Of course.
But it's not the same thing. It's nice for the moment, but intimacy is nice for a lifetime.
Yeah. it sticks with you. People can see it on you.
Yes. We can have intimacy with God. We can have intimacy with friends. We can have intimacy with our wives. And again, giving light to God's an old coot who doesn't want you to have fun. As a married man, if you seek intimacy with your wife, if you pursue her as God pursued the church, as Christ pursued the church and was willing to give himself for her. In other words, if your wife knows you are mic drop in love with her to the point where you would literally fall on a grenade for her, intimacy becomes a very easy issue. What's not to love?
Of course.
So God being God, is God that doesn't want you to have fun? No, he wants you to have fun. Because if you're pursuing your wife in intimacy, intensity will get to be part of the deal.
Yep. It'll come right alongside.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think you rightly point out, far too many husbands are willing to settle with the intensity without seeking the intimacy. And in husband after husband after husband, I have seen that's a lie.
Yeah. And it's going to run dry.
Yes.
It's bound to happen.
This is a big reason why men cheat.
Yeah.
They've never sought the intimacy.
Yeah.
Only the intensity. And after a while, that's all you're seeking. It's stale.
Yeah. And I think that's another thing. If you've only experienced intensity and then now you're in a setting where intimacy is what you're going to be leaning on, you can run into some roadblocks where it's, well, why isn't it as intense as it was supposed to be, or like it was with all those other people? And now here I am in the fireplace and it doesn't feel so intense. What is this other thing? You don't even recognize the intimacy. You'd rather have a bonfire or a wildfire.
Yes.
But you can't put that wildfire in here. It's not going to fit in a fireplace.
No.
Yeah. I think that the transition from those who have had premarital sex into the marital setting, that part can be really hard. And that's why they're like, well, we need to live together before I got to take it for the test drive.
Yep.
It's not.
No. As a side note, it's a cruel man who equates cars and women.
Agreed.
Sorry, but let's just put it out there.
Agreed. Or woman who says it to a man, because I've heard that on many occasions.
On both sides of the aisle.
Yes.
It's funny you would mention that. I have some very dear friends of mine who lived together several years before they were married as unbelievers. And after their marriage, they came to Christ. And he and I are good friends to the point where we can talk very bluntly and transparently with each other. And I asked him, genuinely, I'm not trying to poke fun at you, I'm not trying to judge you, but I'm interested to know, what were the advantages of you living outside of marriage with a woman who would become your wife? And he knew that I wasn't trying to slap him or judge.
Yeah.
He honestly answered, James, nothing. In fact, more than nothing. There are couples who have been more or less married the same amount of time as us. And I see that they're far further in a deep marriage than me and my wife are. And a big part of it is because I bought into the test drive thing.
Yeah.
It was not true.
Yeah.
It was a behemoth lie. And for the very reason that you say, is if you get your taste set on unending intensity, intimacy looks different.
Yep.
Not every moment of every day is going to be intense, but it can be intimate. When my father died, my parents were married 29 years. One of the last things he said to me was, your mother and I have been together 29 years. On my wedding day, I didn't think I could love her anymore, or that she could be any more beautiful. And I'm wrong on both counts. That was intimacy. It was an intimate relationship with my parents. Does that mean that he woke up astounded every morning for 29 years? Of course not.
Can't.
Of course not. But it did mean he knew what real intimacy and real love was.
Yeah.
There was intensity along the way. You're looking at the product of at least one of those, right?
Yes.
But he knew the difference and appreciated both.
Yeah. I really love that example. Like, it's so important. And I can think, having gone into a marriage, trying to figure that out, what it looks like to have intimacy in a marriage. Like, I feel like we didn't have great examples of that, Lexi and I, and it has really taken us a long time. So like that example of your dad, I am going to carry that forever. Just because there's been that few levels of examples. Now there's plenty that I've learned from my parents' marriage. There's plenty that we've learned from her parents' marriage. And there's some great examples out there. And no marriage is perfect.
None.
Even your dad and your mom's. None.
None.
So we take examples of each, but we just, I think it was like a year and a half in, 2 years in, we're going through this and we're just like, man, we really can't point to anybody that we think has it figured out like that. Another marriage that I think of that was really important for us starting off is her grandparents, affectionately referred to as Candy Grandma and Candy Grandpa. Ironic because he was a dentist. Quite ironic.
So it kept him in business. Candy kept him in business.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. But they set a really good example for us, just the joy that you can have in a marriage, and they are well into their senior years. And so we could look to them and see the energy and the passion that they had for each other. And I'm not going to get into the intensity side of things, but that intimacy was such, like that end goal was so easy for us to aspire to, but we didn't feel like we had people around us who really showed us how to get there. And I have to say this because his name is Ray Lack. And I remember I was impressed by him, kind of like yourself, right away. One of the coolest things about him is, first of all, he's so well experienced. This guy has done everything. And he has a collection of Bibles. And I was just infatuated by them when I first met him. I met him on Easter. We went, they live in Colorado Springs. And I remember I got his phone number. I went home, and there was something that I was working on. I was creating a Bible study using one of the Bibles that he let me take from him. And I was just like, I have to tell him that what I'm doing right now. And I was in my dorm room, but you know how you're nervous when you call somebody for the first time? So I'm looking at my phone.
I remember when I called you first. Yes, I know that.
Yes. So I'm looking at my phone, and it has his contact, and I'm like working up the courage to actually hit the button. It probably took me like 5 to 15 minutes. It was a minute. Longer than I wish. But it took me so long that when I finally pressed the button and he answered the phone, I said, "What's up, Ray? I'm Lack." His name was so burned in my brain. So every time I even mentioned that I might have talked to him, Lexi's like, "What's up, Ray? I'm Lack."
Oh my gosh.
It's so funny. But he has set such a good example for us. And it took them a couple tries too. And that's what we're trying to break. Let's get it on the first attempt.
Yeah.
Let's go from intensity to intimacy and make it a nice, smooth 70-year transition.
Yes.
And really perfect it. But having those examples around, and I guess that's a very common theme in your stories. You had the examples.
Let me give you a story. I would have been in college at this point. So my father is not more than a few years away from dying. And we're sitting at the dinner table, and there was some commercial of some sort that was on. And he said, "Oh my gosh, that reminds me of our time in," I don't remember all the details, but let's just say, "That reminds me of our time in Cincinnati. You remember that trip?" And she was like, "Yeah, with the goat." And he said, "Yeah." But they both kind of look off into space and smile. Right? They were in tune to the point where they could finish each other's conversations. He'd start, she'd finish, or vice versa. They were just in tune.
Yeah.
Even as a punk college kid, I remember thinking, man, that's what I want.
Yeah.
And especially from my viewpoint now, but even back then it was like better to never marry than to marry badly and not have a chance at that.
Yep. There was something that you mentioned to me that gave me a lot of insight as to how you viewed that. Would you be willing to share how your mother came to accept your celibacy?
Yeah.
Because that's not a pressure that we just put on ourselves.
Oh, no.
There's a lot of people who that pressure is top down.
And far too many people have made far too many mistakes because of it.
Yes.
I'm in my mid-20s. I'm still stateside. This is before I had gone off to the mission field. And around your age, mid-20s, my mother started in on, where are my grandkids? Why don't I have grandkids yet? Because all of her friends were at the age where their children, my age, were starting to marry, have children. My grandbabies. Why don't I have any grandbabies? And it became kind of a constant piece of conversation.
Yep.
Conversation that, I'll be honest, made me feel less than a man. I'm not keeping up with the Joneses here, and my friends are getting married. They're having kids. I'm not, and am I less than? Am I inadequate? And of course, this was not my mother's intentions, but the enemy has no problems hitting below the belt.
Yes. Yep.
It wasn't her saying that. It was him through her. And then suddenly, that well just quit giving water. She just, like, dead stop, like out of the blue, stopped asking me, to the point where I'm curious enough to ask, why don't I hear about the grandkids anymore? What's going on there? And she said, I have 3 friends my age who have children your age, mid-20s, who are in the middle of horrible, terrible, awful divorces, property battles, custody battles, money battles. One was trying to decide who gets the dog. They were horrible, horrible, terrible divorces. 4, from my perspective, almost children, young folk, right? And she said, I looked at my friends who are heartbroken, crushed, that their kids are having to walk through this awful, awful thing. And I repented before God. And I told him, God, better I never have grandchildren than my son marry badly. And boy, that stuck. That stuck. And that's one of the things that actually helped me to get through some choices, because I'm not a eunuch. I've had opportunities.
Yes.
I've also had opportunities to wed. Twice I came very close. And God just kind of put his hand in at the time. And looking back now, I see why God did it in both cases. It was ultimately for my good. But that actually helped me in my celibacy, was that my family was on board. My mother was on board. Right? That there was not already an external pressure. Up to that point, it had been a pressure.
Yeah.
This isn't something that internally you just deal with. Often there are external pressures
Absolutely.
which lead to horrible decisions and terrible mistakes. I have a friend my age that I knew in high school. We're a few weeks apart age-wise, and lost contact with him, met back up with him in the early 2000s, and he was on wife number 4.
Boy.
And already complaining about her. And after a while, after we got to know each other, I, as diplomatically as possible, pointed out to him, there is a common denominator on all 4 of these marriages. One thing that can be absolutely pointed to as the commonality. Bless his soul, he made the mistake of saying, "What?" And I told him, from a good heart, I wasn't trying to slap him.
Of course.
The denominator is you. And as you pointed out, the harm of 3 broken marriages ahead of that one, and whatever damage and trauma to both him and to his former spouses.
And the children that might have offsprung.
Yes.
And
All
their
of
children.
that. And their children and their children.
Yes.
I'm dealing currently with a friend almost my age who is still working through the trauma of what his father did to him as a boy. So all of that matters. All of it matters. But the answer to your question is that actually helped.
Yeah.
Walking through that helped. And again, if we're just going to cut honest, it's not easier now to honor God with my body than it was 45 years ago. It's still a challenge.
That scale hurts just as much as the first one did.
It hurts just as much now as it did 45 years ago.
There was another gentleman who broke it down in a different analogy, but he said, if we're going to call sanctification the peeling back of the onion, that 15th row of onion smells just as bad as the first one did. It's never going to stop smelling just as bad as it did when you first started.
Yeah. And anytime I get on my spiritual high horse, God reminds me that I'm just about as oniony now as I was when I first came to Christ at 13.
Yep.
Only that much less.
Yeah. Yep. And that much isn't because you're any better.
No. No, it's because I have a God who shows me grace and kindness and mercy and compassion.
Yeah. What a gift.
What a gift.
James, this has been so much fun.
My pleasure.
We might have to mess around and do some more of these.
Why not?
Yeah, of course. If I may, I'll ask you a couple of wrap-up questions.
Please.
All right. The first being, is James your favorite book in the Bible?
Funny you would ask that. Again, I just keep reminding, you're dealing with a children's pastor.
Yes.
And children love visuals. So let me give you a visual. I think our faith rests on what I would call a stool, a 3-legged stool.
Okay.
The legs of those stool are piety, study, and action. Now, you want to talk about a word that's really gotten messed up, it's piety.
Yeah, break that down.
Piety has come to be understood as self-righteousness. It's not. Piety is a life fully devoted to God. We're mortals, we'll never do it perfectly. But it is that desire to have a life fully devoted to God. Now, how is it that you are able to live a life fully devoted to God? You have to know what that devotion looks like. And how do you do that? You study. You study God's Word. God's Word is the manual to our lives. Whatever you need, there's something in there.
Yep.
You have financial problems, it's in there. You're having a satisfying sex life with your wife, it's in there. I've just peeped several hundred husbands.
If you need a reference, Song of Solomon.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Whatever, it's in there. Right? But if you are living a life devoted to God, and if you have studied to understand what that is, but nothing comes of it, what's the point?
Yep.
It has to result in action.
Yep.
The outward visible sign that I'm walking with Christ.
The movement of that study moving from your brain to your heart.
Yes. Yes. There are no secret spies in Christ. It has to be obvious.
Yeah.
It has to reflect in my character.
Yeah. You'll be known by the love.
In my flesh, am I going to be gracious or kind or considerate? No, because that doesn't benefit me.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm living a life in Christ, that ought to be apparent.
Mm-hmm.
By my thoughts, by my deeds.
I like that. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the answer to the question is, I actually like two books almost equally.
Okay.
And because of the three-legged stool.
Okay.
Romans and James.
The namesake.
Romans, Paul was writing to a church that he had no thing in founding. It had been set up outside of him. So he's writing this letter as an introduction. This is who I am. This is what I believe. And in Romans, we find virtually every, what I call top-tier fundamental doctrine of Christianity. It's in Romans.
Mm-hmm.
It is a treasure trove of doctrinal issues, right? James was very practical. He's not heavy on doctrine, but he's very heavy on it's got to show in your life.
He's all action.
So Paul in Romans covers study, because in order to act, I have to know how to act.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And James is the action. And the two men are so obviously devoted in their lives to Christ. They were so motivated to live for Christ.
Yes. And eventually die.
Martyrs' deaths, no less.
Yep.
For those who think the gospel is a joke and a scam and a lie, do men die for the sake of a scam or a joke or a lie? Men don't die for that. But by tradition, every one of the apostles, save John, died a martyr's death. And let's take it further. I knew a Russian pastor who pastored in Soviet times when it was against the law to do so. Twice he went to jail for preaching. That was his crime. He preached.
Talk about oppression.
Yes. Both times he could have recanted. That is to say, he could have said, it's all a scam, it's all a lie, none of it's true.
Yep.
And twice he said, show me my jail cell. How can I say what's true is not true? Do men do that for a lie? No.
No.
They do it because it's the truth. And both of these guys who lived such a life fully devoted to God willingly died awful, horrible deaths for the sake of the cross.
They saw the completion of that sanctification, reached the glorification.
Yes. Two men justified in very different ways.
Yeah.
But justified,
Yep.
sanctified in very different ways. But they both saw glorification. They both of them heard from their Lord, well done, good and faithful servant.
Yeah. What an example of how our journeys can look so different. And even our perspective and understanding and our relationship with God can look different. But we're all looking for and will receive the same glorification.
Yes.
So having grace for people who don't have the same journey as you. You're a great example. Your whole ministry is based around giving as many kids as possible the testimony of intimacy, not intensity. I got intimacy with God as early as I could. That's what you want kids to say.
Yeah.
The other testimonies are great. They're very intense.
Yes.
Wonderful. Because intimacy came eventually.
Yes.
They are just as good. But why not have that intimacy earlier? And that intimacy might look different than the intimacy that someone else has.
Yes.
But both intimate, nonetheless. I love that. Do you have a favorite verse from either one of these or any book in the Bible?
This is a key part of the question because it's evolved over time. Mm-hmm. God has used different verses at different stages of my life. Obviously, Romans 8:1, that was my first favorite verse.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Let me tell you my favorite verse right now.
Okay.
Isaiah 43:18 and 19. Not remember the past events. Pay no attention to things of old. Look, I'm about to do something new. Even now it's coming. Do you not see it? Indeed, I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. As an old coot, it speaks to my heart that God is saying, don't remember past glories. Mm-hmm. Because even at your age, I'm doing something new.
You haven't lost all your potential.
No. As young men, the enemy comes to you with certain things. As old men, he comes to us with, you're all washed up. Mm-hmm. You're all done. Mm-hmm. Time to go to pasture. You got nothing else to add to God's kingdom. You're all finished. Mm-hmm. And God clearly, through this old prophet, he was an old man when he wrote this, through this old prophet saying, not yet, not done with it yet.
Mm-hmm. Behold.
Brevinn, I've read God's word stem to stern many, many times. I have yet to see the verse that says retirement in God's service, not as a pastor, as a God follower.
Yep.
Ends on this side of life. Mm-hmm. It doesn't. Mm-hmm. Ends on the other side. Mm-hmm. Again, speaking honestly, there's a lot of folk my age who are in Christ who think they can be spiritually retired. We'll let the younger folk do it.
Yeah, I guess it's that same idea deceiving you later in life. I'll figure it out later, or I figured it out. I'm good now.
I'm good now. And I challenge those people. Show me the verse where it says that.
Yeah.
Because I've not gone into it yet. If I'm alive and breathing, God's got something for me to do.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really good. Speaking of being alive and breathing, mm-hmm. If Jesus Christ in his physical form was alive and breathing today, what do you imagine he would say to our culture? But I also think I'm curious what he would say to you if he walked in this room right now.
To the culture, I think he may say, when I said I am the way, the life, I was not kidding. It's interesting, I have gained so much understanding of my culture by not living in it for 20 years.
Yep.
And I came back. We Americans, we always want a plan B. You know, something better may come along.
Yep.
We see commitment as a bad thing.
Yep.
A commitment locks me into something.
Even that is so temporary.
Yes. And clearly, Christ said, there is no other way. Mm-hmm. But what does he lock us into? Life, liberty. Can you imagine? We serve a God that we can give him the ashes of our life and he gives us beauty in return. We hand him death. He hands us life. Who doesn't want to be locked into that?
Yeah.
I'm fine with being locked into that.
Yes.
Right? As to me personally, he might say, for the 50-something years that you've been following me, you've spent far too much time listening to other people's opinions of you. not enough listening to me about it. And he wouldn't say that to cause guilt or regret.
Romans 8:1.
Yes. He would do it to remind me now of what he was trying to tell me when I was a 13-year-old boy. If I say you are, you are.
Yep. Because I am.
Brevinn, do you realize your existence is not based on the passion that your mother and father had for each other, but on God's passion for you? And when that locks in, it is life-giving.
Yeah. What are some resources outside of the Bible that have been really fruitful for you? Podcasts, audiobooks, sermon series, whatever it is.
Yeah. Of course, being an old coot, I'm going to have to start off with old school, right?
Please.
C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
He is, without question, the finest apologist of the last century. Now, just so we're on the same page, apologists aren't people who apologize for the gospel. They are people who defend the gospel.
Quite the opposite, actually, yeah.
Lewis was an Oxford professor, avowed atheist. He decided he was going to prove Christianity to be the scam that it was. The only way you can do that is to read God's word. The more he read it, the more he understood how wrong he was. How right God is. What do you know? Everything the man has written, I've read. The Great Divorce, the Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, A Grief Observed. I mean, all of it monumentally incredible stuff.
You mentioned his work earlier, Narnia, Chronicles of Narnia.
Yes, a children's series that was anything but for children. Children enjoy it.
Yes.
But adults do too.
I read that before I read the Bible.
Yes. Great stuff.
Yep. Screwtape Letters. So good. So much to be gleaned from that as to how the kingdom realm functions.
It's a fascinating book. The thing that intrigues me with C.S. Lewis is that he was an incredibly brilliant man. He was an Oxford professor.
Yeah.
This guy was like uber smart.
Yes.
And you can see that he tries so hard to write down to stupid people like me level.
Yes.
He's working at it. He's doing his best to get through to me.
Yes.
Right? The Screwtape Letters, the entire book, you have to think in the opposite.
Yeah.
Because it's a senior demon writing to a demon in training his nephew.
Yep.
One of my favorite is, and this is such wisdom, to understand how the enemy works.
Yes.
He says to his nephew, you're spending way too much time and energy drawing your patient into temptation. What you really need to do is just make sure he never thinks of God. Sports, finances, his job, his wife, anything but God. And what's one of the chief ways the enemy uses to move us away from God? Distraction.
Distraction.
Not temptation.
Yep.
Distraction.
Yep.
Is there anything wrong with watching football? Nothing wrong with watching football. Unless that puts me in a position where I'm never thinking about God anymore.
That is the exact reason why I think this is so important. If I were to assign my own value to the podcast, I believe that presence is anti-distraction.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. This is the funny thing with idols, and he's, in a roundabout way, that's what he's pointing out. This is the funny thing about idols. Often idols in and of themselves, those things that we make idols, aren't bad things. Is it wrong to love your wife? On the contrary.
Certainly not.
Certainly not. Unless she becomes more overridingly important to you than your own God, who made her in the first place.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So that.
I love that. Yeah. C.S. Lewis is so good.
Super good stuff. But, contrary to popular opinion, you can teach new tricks to old dogs. Lecrae has a podcast, In the Deep. Phenomenal material. Phenomenal material.
Yes.
About marriage, about sex within marriage, about intimacy with God. Just unbelievably good stuff.
Yeah, I need to check that out because I've listened to some of his stuff with Pastor Tim Ross, and he's under basically Pastor Tim Ross's podcast network. I think they're related in some way, but super spiritually developed and spiritually mature, and really kind of comes at it from the. It's nice to know that somebody who's that famous was able to maintain his integrity and intimacy throughout that journey.
Can you imagine a man who is famous but has not made fame an idol? It's such a strong temptation.
There it is. Yeah, really hard. Thank you for that.
Surely.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And because of that, my music tastes are eclectic, which is a nice way of saying kind of weird.
Yeah.
Because it stretches from the Gaithers to Lecrae.
All right.
Just all of it.
Yeah.
If it's praise to God, I'm good.
Its own. That's so funny. That's cool. Well, James, I can say that you've given much life to me, as God has given much life to you.
Bless God.
And I can hope only for the same longevity that you've been able to have, not only life, but your ministry and self-identity. There have been so many people on this planet that are better because you have existed.
Praise God.
So I thank you for that.
Praise God.
I'm one of them.
Praise God.
And I certainly hope that there's a lot of other people out there that get to say the same thing after this too. Thank you again.
Bless you.
And thank you guys for joining us as well. Of course, take a moment to make a moment. We'll see you next time.